what AI is in medicine, but really particularly in food allergies.
What is the kind of the success rate of this?
Our success rate is absolutely fantastic. We're at a 99% success rate, and we've been at that number for many, many years. Remember, it's hard to keep 99% when you have, roughly about 100 to 150 to 200 new patients starting every month.
It's kind of your insights into kind of the blood testing and how accurate that is for allergies.
With every iteration, it's gotten a little bit better, but there's still not a single test, not one particular test that could actually answer that question. And that's where I leaned on AI to see if it could actually answer that.
Before we jump into the podcast, can I ask for two massive favors from you guys? The first one being, if you're listening to the podcast, make sure to click that subscribe button. The more listeners, the bigger guests I can get on the podcast to kind of share their stories and break the stigma. And the second favor being, if you're watching this on YouTube, over 89% of you guys have not clicked that subscribe button. So if you are enjoying the podcast, make sure to click that subscribe button. Honestly, it means the world to me, and honestly, I appreciate all your support. Let's jump back into the podcast. Dr. Randhawa, absolute pleasure to get you on the podcast. I think it's such an exciting episode. I've had obviously doctors and professors on the podcast before, but your work within kind of AI and food allergies is such an exciting space. And you could say a new space as well. So absolute pleasure to get you on today. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Daniel. Thanks for having me. I think this is a great opportunity to talk about what AI is in medicine, but really particularly in food allergies. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and with the guests, I always find it quite interesting to kind of go back maybe to them kind of early years, obviously how you kind of obviously became a doctor, then maybe later on, obviously your relationship with food allergies.
Totally. I don't have the typical story, I guess. My dad was a veterinarian and animal doctor, but he had a PhD research background. So he came from India to the States about 50 plus years ago at that stage. And so I grew up, kind of learning what science looked like through the lens of a clinician. Think of it, if you're taking care of an animal, that he would look at it very differently. And I saw that growing up. And I got to say that had a huge influence on how I look at things as a doctor. And so I've always had that interest. But specific to food allergies, honestly, I have to say I had no exposure or experience with it as a kid. Certainly I saw, some kids in school who had it, but that was pretty uncommon, or at least certainly was not talked about. And I really was not introduced to it until I was in my later training as a physician and, working in the hospital setting in the ICU. That's when I had the greatest direct face-to-face with food allergies. And it absolutely floored me. I just really did not see that part of the condition. And that's certainly where my interest started.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I don't think many people knew, obviously, even when I got diagnosed with an allergy in the 90s, it wasn't very kind of commonly, like people didn't know about the severities. I think they did and they didn't. Like you obviously, like now it's constantly in the media, obviously the public are now more kind of like educated. I mean, when you was on that pathway where you was in the ICU, did you know, what was your kind of first say? Obviously it wasn't food allergies, was it? Did you kind of work in a few different departments until you kind of found out that kind of passion and that love?
Yeah, absolutely. So I went into medicine, really not sure where I wanted to land. So I worked in the ICU, I worked as a lung specialist, and then I really got interested in the world of transplant. So, this is transplants of organs like liver, bone marrow transplants, and lungs particularly. So I found it really interesting because in many ways I wanted to be the last guy that people saw in some ways. When they come to you, that's it. They're looking for you to find a solution. And I found it really interesting on how in a single transplant, just for one single patient, we would invest incredible amount of time, hours, and people, but more particularly invested an entire amount of data. Like we would collect so much information on one person to make sure the organ matches well with the recipient. And then that's kind of how we did it. And even to this day, it's exactly how we do it. And then I realized we don't do that for any other disease. Like we don't invest that much time or effort in data. We just kind of use the art of medicine. And I really found that interesting. And then, of course, when I first saw food allergies in the ICU in the hospital setting, that's where it started. I said, well, hold on a second. Maybe we should be applying this approach to food allergies.
Yeah, I know 10 years ago, there wasn't really kind of a register for people going into the hospital because of anaphylaxis. And this is like within the UK. I mean, kind of like within the US, was there any kind of much research or data surrounding food allergies during that time?
Daniel, unfortunately, even to this day, we don't have that data. At least with NHS, you have an opportunity to collect it, which is really useful. But here, to this day, we have very limited data. We do know a lot of patients end up in the ER, in the hospitals, and the ICUs, and we have some information towards fatal events. But unfortunately, because we have this kind of disconnected healthcare system, we don't even have that information, sadly.
Yeah. Would you say within kind of, when you kind of mentioned there with the transplants and obviously the data, would you say that was your first kind of like glimpse into, like you see, like within food allergies, they didn't have that, or kind of other conditions? I mean, that kind of like stems on quite nicely into kind of the data and research into AI as well.
Yeah, totally. I mean, when I could tell you a specific story. When I was in a very large children's hospital and we had these patients come in, I remember pulling up their information, their data, and I said, this patient who has a peanut allergy, their blood values for peanut were very low. They were less than 1, like 0.9, and that patient was extremely ill. I mean, on a ventilator, extremely ill from a peanut exposure. And down the hall in the next ICU, it was a very large hospital, large ICU. Down the hall was another child who ate same amount of peanuts. Their peanut numbers were about 90. And that patient was relatively fine on a little bit of oxygen. It was, likely going to go home later that day. So I immediately saw this discrepancy that somehow the values that are present, these numbers that we, test people with, are not really reflective of the disease. And that's kind of where it all began.
Yeah. When you mentioned there, like, obviously the values, obviously, like within kind of like the blood tests, obviously that gives you a bit of an indication. I mean, how accurate is that? Because I know it's also a bit like bad practice in terms of like, if you do a blood test and you send it off through like a third party, it's always great, obviously, to kind of do it for your doctors so you get a full kind of 360. But what's kind of your insights into kind of the blood testing and how accurate that is for allergies?
I think maybe before I answer that question, I'd even take a step back and say, look at all of medicine. Look at all kinds of diseases, strokes, heart attacks, and such. Is there a single test that predicts the disease well? And the answer is not. No single test is going to say, hey, here's the disease, outside of something like a biopsy, something really invasive, right? So in the world of food allergy, we've had such a slow development of testing. I mean, I don't tell you the whole story, but you're going back 60, 80 years with skin testing. You're looking at the late 70s with blood testing, some improvements in the 90s. But when I first got into the space, I was really interested in improving the testing data themselves, the types of tests. Can we get better? And with every iteration, it's gotten a little bit better, but there's still not a single test, not one particular test that could actually answer that question. And that's where I leaned on AI to see if it could actually answer that question.
Why is that? Is it down to budget? I know it's a big issue, obviously, kind of within the UK. There's not many hospitals which specialises not only in food allergies but also kind of the mental implications of that as well. Is that the same in the US?
It's definitely the same. I also think that food allergies here are something that I call like an orphan condition, right? It's something that nobody really wants to own. I'm certainly not your prototypical allergist. I mean, I have a lot of other specialties, but I found that the classical allergy world was not very enthusiastic to deal with this condition. It seemed very complex and risky. The other specialty that would technically deal with the food allergy would be a gastroenterologist or a GI doctor. They certainly don't want to deal with these cases. So I found that there's really almost a lack of interest in trying to solve this problem. And certainly when I started almost 20 years ago, that's what I saw.
Yeah. And what was your kind of first, when you kind of look back, your first kind of time you kind of come across AI and kind of thought like, well, this could potentially kind of work within the healthcare space? Do you remember that first kind of experience with that?
Yeah. I would say it happened a couple times. One was actually not in the field of food allergy. I was doing work in another lung disease, a lung disease that affects people with something called sickle cell, which is a blood-based disease. And I started pulling all kinds of data from the lungs of these patients. And I started looking at patterns. AI is all about pattern recognition. And I was able to see patterns, and we started utilizing that to actually build a forecasting type of diagnosis and treatment. Now, it was very small back then. I'm talking about 180 patients, things of that nature. But to this day, that work continues. That's how good it has been for that one condition. And I started realizing that if we can collect enough data, if we can collect enough information, we can then start to look at patterns. But you must collect the same information on every single patient. And that's the only way you can study the immune system of individuals, and indeed, especially in food allergies, the proteins that they're actually eating, the proteins like peanuts that cause the problem. We need to study those as much as we study the immune systems themselves.
With AI, I mean, how much do you rely on it? Because obviously, is there any mistakes, or obviously there's always human errors, but how much you kind of rely on kind of AI and also your own kind of intuitions as well?
Yeah. I mean, I'll even kind of take that back a few years. By 2008, when I started my food allergy work, the first thing I do, and as anybody has to do in AI or really any sort of software space, is you have to build data sets. So we built our first data sets by 2008, and that meant we took the blood of hundreds of patients who have food allergies and started analyzing that data and built a data set. We also started studying peanuts, cashews, pistachios, a slew of different proteins in the laboratory, and we built data sets there as well. So now I have these two very large data sets. Those two large data sets at that time, remember this is a long time ago before there was Chat GPT and such, we actually then started using machine learning to see what patterns existed between these two things. Back then, I would say the machine learning system was still roughly about 80 to 90% accurate. So right away, I knew I was onto something, that we could actually make a diagnosis using a machine learning AI type system. But I didn't have enough data. I didn't have enough patients. And that's really where I started to say, hey, we need to get this into a model, and we need to start bringing patients into the system. And now 15,000 patients later, we have an immensely robust system that is treating patients from all around the world.
I was going to ask, like, what kind of the perspective from kind of the healthcare or people looking in, what are their thoughts on AI? Is he a bit of kind of skeptical? Is this right, or is it actually going to help? I mean, it'd be great to kind of get your thoughts on that. Right?
It's a great question. I'd say 8 or 9 years ago, there was a lot of skepticism. I mean, they didn't understand the concept. Even my physician colleagues that I trained and I hired were very skeptical. They said, yeah, we're not taught this in medical training. So how come you're using these systems that operate in many ways more efficiently and maybe even better with accuracy than the human operator? And that was that many years ago. I think in the last 2 to 3 years, there's been a much greater acceptance, which I appreciate, because we're seeing AI now deployed in a few other spaces. There's a great story behind a system called Watson, which was designed by IBM. And, it's done a lot of great things in trying to establish itself in healthcare. It also eventually did not work well in healthcare, but from those types of examples, I think people have learned and said, hey, let's give this a try, because clearly this is working in many other sectors of the economy. Why not try it in healthcare?
Yeah. So obviously, with the Food Institution, obviously, which you set up, was it is it 15 years ago now?
It's almost 18 years of work. Our actual institute went live in 2015.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been quite revolutionary, obviously, back then. I mean, how many patients have you seen now? You mentioned over 15,000.
Yeah, 15,000. We're the largest globally. Any kind of group of food allergy patients, we're on the map. And again, we've been doing this consistently since basically 2005.
Yeah. What's your experience? I thought it'd be great, obviously, while you're on the podcast, obviously, we'll kind of talk about TIP and obviously the treatment you're doing there and how effective it is. But before we kind of jump into that, we kind of interesting to hear kind of your perspective with, obviously, kids is in regards to kind of allergy anxiety. It's something which for me has been on the rise. I've always kind of put it down to like the media. It's more at the forefront now. When I had an allergy when I was a kid, it wasn't really spoke about in the news, so you didn't really hear about these allergy deaths, and if you did, it's at the local newspaper. It's not something you kind of see all over the news now. What's your kind of thoughts with kind of parents? Have you kind of seen a lot of allergy anxiety within kind of the parents and the child?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. As somebody who deals with chronic illness, I have many patients of all different disease states. And when you're dealing with a chronic disease, it is anxiety provoking for anybody who's dealing with it. And when I first started dealing with food anaphylaxis and food allergies, I didn't understand what that meant for my patients. And I'll tell you just a quick story. I mean, I remember, this is going back to 2007 or so, where I had a patient who was an American football player who was, in high school. And, we worked very hard on his case. He had peanut and several tree nut allergies, and we finished everything, and he was in remission from our program. And I remember talking to him and saying, look, I was showing him his data. I mean, literally, I was showing it to him on a piece of paper and demonstrating how all this improvement was and wonderful. And all he talked about was how this has improved his mental health. His state of anxiety. He also had depression. He was previously on medications. And it was interesting because I was fully focused on safety. I said, look, imagine an entire life where you don't have to worry about this condition anymore. But all he talked about was his frame of mind. And I think that was one of the most eye-opening experiences I've had. And to this day, we have actually tried to focus on mental health with our patients. And it has been extremely difficult. I got to be just very direct about it. We've treated hundreds of physicians' children in our program. We've treated hundreds of psychologists' children in our program. And I have gone to them individually and in groups, and I have asked them, what can we do to better assess? I mean, forget about treatment of food allergies, but just the food allergy population as a whole. How can we address this condition better? And the honest answer I've received is we don't know, because no one is really studying this condition. And to me, this is not an eating disorder, right? This is something very different. This is a regular awareness that you can have a reaction, and even the best of security and systems that may exist, you can still have a reaction. And what that does to your social interactions and how you can actually develop relationships becomes very, very difficult. So I completely agree with your point. And in fact, it's an area we are trying to study right now, but frankly, we're at the earliest phases of it.
Yeah, it's so important. Even myself, I think it wasn't until like maybe 5-6 years ago it started to kind of really affect me. And I think it's because maybe it's when I started making obviously the blog now, which I have to empower people with food allergies. And I was creating this allergy content all the time, and it was doing really well. But I think the kind of the flip of the coin to that was my anxiety was getting worse. So it's been hard to trying to find that balance. And I think like within the UK as well, like from speaking with like professors as well, there's just not enough kind of trained kind of psychologists which specializes within that space. And if I was talking from my own personal experience, like I've recently got a therapist to help me with my food allergy and anxiety. And it's funny, when I reached out to my private healthcare, and I'm really lucky to have it, I got it through work, and they put me in touch with people with like food disorders, and I was like, no, it's not that, and it's just obviously like a lack of kind of training and awareness. But I was really lucky that her daughters happened to have food allergies. I didn't know this until I got this therapist, and yeah, it's been really interesting to kind of that kind of chain of thought in the mind. So she kind of mentioned to me, and this might be helpful for the listeners as well, is like you've kind of got that fear and the threat of obviously having an allergic reaction, but you've also got the facts as well. And the facts could be, look, I've told them, I've made them aware, they've seen the allergy card, I've spoke to the chef, and they're all the facts. But sometimes my kind of chain of thought is like you go to the fear. So no, I think it is such an important part of allergies, which I don't necessarily feel like it's spoke about enough in some ways.
I will say, I think, the UK is far more advanced than the States. I was in London last year, and I'm always impressed by the awareness that's there by restaurants, food industry. It's definitely talked about. And I think that's important, right? You have to talk about it first in order to have any kind of impact. And here in the States, I think we just have a long way to go.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting when you kind of hear like the kind of difference between the UK and the US, and obviously the US is a lot bigger and so in different places. But I was going to ask you, what's your thoughts on the auto injector? Is it obviously something for me? I feel like within obviously the last 10-15 years, it's not really adapted or it's not really changed. And you could obviously say like the EpiPen has kind of monopolized the market in some ways. Are you surprised that not much kind of research or kind of budget has gone into that to make it smaller?
It's a great question. So the EpiPen came out, or what was the first version of EpiPen, back in the 1970s. And, you certainly understand this better than folks who don't have food allergies. But if you're carrying around this heavy object that's spring loaded, and you are now in a situation where you have to use it, and you maybe haven't used one for a few years, number one, right? So practice is part of the issue. And now all of a sudden you have to place this thing in your thigh and let the spring loading injection move and deliver the actual result. I can tell you that, this old archaic EpiPen is not suited for 2023. I mean, it's not fair to ask people to carry this thing around. Most of them are absolutely frightened to use it. We have such a large number of patients, and we survey our parents, and certainly over 2/3 of our parents will say that they are very uncomfortable administering an EpiPen. And that, I mean, imagine that's a parent, right? I mean, they don't even have to necessarily deal with the condition. So I agree with you. I think there has to be something better. But when I first was in this space back in 2005, I actually tried to design a better EpiPen. I tried to design actually a product. I built a prototype where it was not only an EpiPen, but it actually injected 2 additional drugs at the same time. And I designed it in a way that it would essentially strap on to the leg and be think of it as a motion-based countdown. Okay. And I thought it was going to work. I thought it was a good idea, and it certainly did work. I mean, we did several small trials with this, and it would stop a reaction very effectively, but it was large, somewhat difficult to carry around with.
Yeah.
And what I tell folks is, no matter how good you are at using an EpiPen, it is about when you use the EpiPen and your ability to recognize that you are at a risk position. And ultimately, I think that's the problem, right? Like, you can carry an EpiPen, hopefully you know how to use it, but if you don't use it at exactly the right time, and perhaps maybe you need to use more than one, that's where this condition becomes really difficult. So, it was at that time that I eventually decided maybe I should be focusing on treatment rather than just a rescue administration.
No, that's really interesting. You mentioned the additional drugs. What was that alongside the adrenaline?
Yeah. So one of them was an injectable steroid that was fast acting, and just like many other things, it could actually inject into the local muscle site. And the other one was an antihistamine. It was actually a combination of antihistamines that had great effect into the muscle. I even had a name for it. It was called Triject. And,
nice.
Again, I gave it a fair shot, but ultimately I was unable to get it to the finish line.
Yeah. It's interesting. You mentioned there, obviously the device and kind of the size of it as well. And I always get asked all the time, like, where do I carry it? And I'm like, no, I just carry it in my pants. But like you say, when you're on nights out or you're having drinks with the guys, like, there's only so much you can fit in your pocket apart from your phone and your wallet and 2 EpiPens.
I'll say that EpiPen, remember, there's a couple new devices that are trying to get on the market. One of them is like a nasal spray. I'm not sure how much of that's been talked about, but it tried to get FDA approval here in the U.S. a few months back, and it did not get approval yet. Which I think is.
Do you know why that is?
I mean, we have a pretty rigorous approval process in the federal government. And, I think it's a great concept. I mean, I like the concept a lot. And in fact, as an ICU doctor, we use epinephrine in different ways. We don't necessarily put it in their thigh. You can actually use epinephrine. You can inhale it. You can breathe it in very effectively. It can be deposited in the skin a different way. It doesn't have to be this kind of deep injection.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of ways to get adrenaline into the system. I think what this particular this company did that was not that best is they needed to test it on adults with actual food allergies. They didn't, I know it's difficult to hear, but literally you have to test it on people who have anaphylaxis. And since they did not do that, the FDA was really resistant to just go ahead and approve it.
You mentioned earlier about obviously like the parents, obviously 2/3 the being that obviously that kind of hesitance to kind of use the EpiPen. Do you find within obviously kind of your research, are people using the EpiPen enough, or they're not using it at all in these kind of circumstances?
It's very sad, Daniel. I mean, I'll tell you, we survey our own patients, before they start the program, and 2/3 again of the parents say they're not comfortable. When they're even in our program, about 5% of them, and we're a pretty rigorous program, we're watching and keeping track, and we're doing it with technology, and 5% of our patients will not carry their EpiPen with them. I mean, which I find amazing, you're in active treatment and you don't want to carry it. We appreciate your confidence in us, but that's not the way to do it. And then ultimately, we also surveyed schools, so elementary schools. And we were absolutely surprised that, there's at least one kid with food allergies in every classroom in general. And that means there's an EpiPen sitting either at the teacher's desk or at the nurse's office. And we were absolutely shocked to find that the teachers themselves had almost zero knowledge and zero training on how to administer an EpiPen. So if there is a reaction at school, they're not prepared to deal with it. And this is in the United States. I was very surprised. So we are actually moving towards trying to change that, because I think we need to advocate for this globally, frankly. This is something that everyone should be talking about. Forget about the restaurants for a second, just focus on schools, and let's make sure schools are as safe as possible for kids.
Yeah, because you find that a lot of them sometimes administer kind of into the thumb. And there's a guy called Marx. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's done like it's like defibrillator, but for allergies. So obviously it contains EpiPens, and I think he's got it in over like 200 schools now. So yeah, it's incredible. Obviously the work he's doing. And obviously with like the workshops and the training, and I think it was last year, like every year I try and do like a video on my Instagram, and there's a few of us, and it gets like hundreds of thousands of people views, like in terms of people like getting involved, showing how to use the EpiPen, and like there's such a kind of a lack of like awareness there.
Yeah.
In regards to that kind of timing, I think it's so important you mentioned that as well. In terms of how many symptoms should you look out for until you use the EpiPen? Because I used it once. I had a bit of an itchy throat, but I thought it was anaphylaxis. Looking back, it could have been a panic attack. Do you think you should look out for more than one symptom before you do use the EpiPen?
It's a great question. And what I tell all of our patients is, if you feel you're having a reaction and it's significant for you, because one thing I do know is that all patients, their perception of their symptoms is different. Especially based on age. If you're 4 or 5 years old, 20 years old, or even an adult, your perception of symptoms is going to be different. And the perception is really based on which organ's involved and kind of the size of that organ. So like a quick example is the airway, which is the most critical thing of a very young child. If they're complaining of symptoms, obviously that airway is very small. So we want to make sure they get epi right away and keep that airway nice and open. If you're an adult, you have a much larger airway, about 2.5 times the size of a child's airway. And so you have a little more give to try to, kind of make a decision. But no matter what, if you feel that within the first 3 to 5 minutes of you starting to feel symptoms, if 3 to 5 minutes have gone by and you're not feeling really stable or better, you should just go ahead and use the EpiPen. There's no reason to delay. It's really, really important. I always feel that the mistakes that occur are when individuals are downplaying their symptoms for past 3 to 5 minutes.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, it's always really scary, isn't it, when you're trying to work out, is it just high? Is it a mild reaction, and trying to work out kind of that difference. And to be honest, when I used that, I honestly thought my neck was the interesting thing with that was when they did all the blood tests and they did the heart monitor, everything was okay. So I don't think if it was, it would be great to get your thoughts on this. If it was anaphylaxis, then maybe the symptom, maybe blood levels wouldn't have been as normal as there was. Maybe
that's true, right? Yeah, absolutely. I there's the condition, which is peanut allergy, and what your anaphylactic reaction is depends on many factors. I'll just give you like a couple examples. If you were just exercising, right? You're at the gym and your heart rate was at 125 beats per minute, and then you were just cooling down and you happened to eat something that was contaminated and that had peanut in it. Your chance of having symptoms there is much higher because your heart rate is higher, and that's going to start circulating the allergic response faster, right? So ultimately, if you are feeling symptoms in that setting, you probably want to respond a bit more aggressively. At the same time, if you are absolutely, heart rate's at 60 beats per minute, you're resting and so forth, it might take you much more time to develop symptoms. And indeed, those symptoms may even start to resolve within a matter of minutes because the circulation of the allergic response is really everything, right? As soon as that circulated allergic response is under control, you're good to go. You don't have to worry about it. But the question is, when do you need to deploy that epi? And so that's the gray zone that
Yeah.
everyone's kind of stuck with.
Yeah, it's really hard to kind of find that. I mean, it'd be interesting to kind of hear about obviously the treatment you do now at the Food Allergy kind of Institute, and how the work you're doing is different from kind of these other kind of allergy tests around the US.
Yeah. Well, again, our program, it's called TIP, which is the Tolerance Induction Program, it's one of a kind. This kind of program, again, has been built now for almost 2 decades, and it's purely based on data science on one side. So our number one goal is to give people a proper diagnosis. We have patients who come here from all over the world. We have probably about 300 plus from the UK who are actively in treatment. And when they come in, we'll run their blood, and it's not a massive amount of blood, but it's a moderate amount. And with that blood, we are able to then test and then feed into an AI system. And with that, we can tell them what they're anaphylactic to and how their immune system sees other similar proteins. And so the first step is to say, hey, look, here's what you're anaphylactic to. And you'd be amazed. We have patients come in and they have never eaten shellfish, and we're able to tell that they're anaphylactic to shellfish without them ever knowing that they were at risk. And we can do the same for seeds and other types of tree nuts, grains, things of that nature. And once a patient is then set up with their diagnosis, we then utilize that AI data to actually treat them. And the Tolerance Induction Program induces tolerance. So at the end of treatment, if you're anaphylactic to peanuts, you are consuming peanuts openly without restriction. So you're essentially eating them like a non-allergic person. And in that, your immune system continues to go into remission deeper and deeper over years of time. So to many people, that seems like a curative state. I can understand that because it certainly seemed like a curative state. But for us, on the scientific side, we call that remission. So ultimately, it's a great diagnosis tool. It's a great treatment tool. And the fact that we're able to treat the patients at a distance. I mean, they're not coming here but 12 to 14 weeks at a time from the UK as an example. And in that time, we're treating multiple foods simultaneously. That is our model that we've been using now for 2 decades.
I mean, I was going to ask that from kind of like start to finish. I mean, how long would it take until they can have that, say if they're allergic to peanuts, from doing the tolerance until they can have one peanut? Is that over weeks or months?
So what we do is we look at peanut, almost going back to our discussion about transplants, right? So we take peanut and we break it down into 17 proteins. So we actually measure those proteins, those little sequences, and then we match those proteins against other biosimilars. So think of it as proteins that are related to peanut. So that might be almond, it might be hazelnut, or other specific proteins. So what we're doing is actually having an individual treat specific proteins like hazelnut and almond at very organized vectors or very organized mathematical points. And we actually give that to the patients in a gummy, in a gelatin. And so our manufacturing facility here will produce that individually for every patient. So they start the program, and in roughly about 6 months, we've taken their peanut values. Let's say their peanut value was 75 or 80 points. We're now reducing that number down to 30 or even 25 without ever eating a single peanut. And once we've accomplished that induction by cross-matching the immune system properly, we do start peanut relatively quickly and relatively fast. They're usually eating a peanut in about 3 months, and then they're consuming the end point, which is, again, a 75 peanut challenge, which I know sounds like an incredibly large amount of peanuts, and it is. They're doing a 75 peanut challenge roughly within a year after they start that first peanut.
Yeah, I mean, that must be crazy, kind of the difference there. And what is the kind of the success rate of this?
Our success rate is absolutely fantastic. We're at a 99% success rate, and we've been at that number for many, many years. Remember, it's hard to keep 99% when you have, roughly about 100 to 150 to 200 new patients starting every month. So we're continuing to grow. And the reason why we're so successful, in my opinion, is our AI. It's our technology side of things, right? We're able to test very accurately, use the analytics really, really well. We're able to track those patients. They're able to get these little gummies on an organized basis. So the room for error is very small, and we can kind of then predict. So indeed, our patients come in and we will predict for them in how much time they will be finished with all food proteins. So literally, we can predict when they'll hit remission within about a 75-day window period in the future, which is amazing, right? Imagine having
Yeah,
any other medical condition and saying, hey, in 2 years' time, you will be in remission of your disease.
yeah.
But that's what AI can help you do.
And you mentioned there people from the UK are actually traveling all the way over to the US. I mean, how
Yeah.
many visits do they have to come and see you if they're traveling from the UK, just out of interest?
Yeah, I still remember my first patient from the UK. This is going back to 2012, right? So over a decade ago. And I remember when they showed up and I said, well, how did you even find us? I mean, like we don't advertise what we're doing.
Yeah.
But, she knew somebody and her son had a peanut and egg allergy, those two. And she had to come back for roughly seven visits. And to this day, he's in remission, doing extremely well. And that's one example. I'd say most of our patients are coming back roughly 4 times a year, and it's roughly about 2 years long. That's a fair number.
Yeah. And then after the treatment, once they go into remission, do they still have to eat a little bit every week to kind of make sure they don't kind of go back to being anaphylaxis?
Absolutely. So our goal is to have what we call 7 days of sustained unresponsiveness, or essentially 7 days where you're eating this very large amount of peanuts or any other allergen, and then 7 days later you eat this large amount again. And in between you can eat nothing. You don't have to eat any of it, or you can consume any amount. There's no restrictions. And so for the first year out of remission, year one after they're done with treatment, we do ask the patients to do this on a weekly basis. And to be fair, it's not an overwhelming amount of food proteins, right? It's a limited amount. But by year 2 and year 3, we're often able to draw those food proteins down to 2-week, 3-week, and 4-week cycles. So by the time someone's 3 years in remission, they're often eating this amount of food protein on a monthly basis. It becomes very manageable.
How dangerous is it if they forget? I mean, is there, say, 1 week I forget? How do you kind of then work it out the following week?
The beauty of everything we do is it's based on data, right? So we're constantly collecting data on the patient. So when we start the program, we're doing this large blood draw and analytics, and then we do the same analytics every year. So we know that their immune system is driving deeper and deeper into remission. So the beautiful thing is, if you look at our patients who are 2 years into remission, they are, to be frank, not really following the plan. They're on average missing doses about 30 to 40% of the time. Yet we don't hear from them. They're doing well. They're clinically well. And we have technology. So the technology kind of monitors and assists them and reminds them and so forth, right? But ultimately, what they're doing is they're consuming the food like a non-allergic person, right? So they go to restaurants and they order, peanut products without an issue. They don't even think about it anymore. And I believe that's what ultimately keeps them in this deep state of remission, is that they are consuming these foods like a non-allergic person, which means large, irregular amounts of protein that are going on an ongoing basis.
You mentioned there, obviously, kind of building up that tolerance where they can eat peanuts. Is there a point where, say, they're abroad and they get an ice cream and it's got nuts on? Is it like a kind of a tolerance where there's too much nuts on this product and this could cause a reaction, just out of interest?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if you look at why we challenge somebody to 75 peanuts, right? I mean, that's literally a large cup, and no one, So we do this because every challenge amount, so if it was tree nuts, we're hitting these 22-gram, very large amounts of these challenges, because essentially we want to make sure that when they leave our system, that there's no amount of peanut or any other allergen that they cannot consume. And I'm very proud of that. I mean, we've done this with fish, shellfish, you name it, as far as primary allergens, and our success rate has been the same for all of them. The greatest difficulty, frankly, is with wheat. Wheat bread, wheat and grains are tricky because they have the most number of those matched sequences that we have to have. They surpass peanut. And that's been the one that we will sometimes modify and say, you know what, you probably cannot eat this on a weekly basis. You may have to eat it more frequently. But to be honest, it's not that difficult to eat some pasta or things of that nature. So that's not too big a deal.
So then, obviously, the treatment, is it aimed at just children or is it aimed at teenagers? I'm 31 next week. Could I come to the treatment and could you actually cure my allergy? Because I know a lot of these treatments are always aimed at, obviously, teenagers and not really kind of like adults. So.
Yeah. Well, first, happy birthday in advance.
Cheers.
I started with kids. I started with young kids. 5 years to 10 years was my first group, almost 2 decades ago. And I did that because, in so many ways, that's what I saw in the hospital. I just kind of felt like, that's where I should target things. But in the last 15 years, we started expanding it to teenagers, and now we take up to age 30. But frankly, we're becoming more flexible because we know that we have the data of the immune systems of people in their 20s and now even people in their 30s. So I've been doing this so long that I have patients who are now in their 30s. They have their own children, right? So we're getting to the point where we want to expand this to not only young adults, but even middle-aged adults would be our next phase. And I just say one last thing. I mean, it's really important that there's a difference between what is kind of other forms of immunotherapy or OIT, because what is out there, again, is limited. And what it allows you to do is eat a very minimum amount of peanut for a safety level. But then you have to eat that minimum amount of peanut every day for the rest of your life. You can never actually consume foods openly and easily. Our system and our goal is totally different. We want our patients to actually not worry about food allergies ever again. We want them to consume and eat like a non-allergic person, and that's open without restriction. They can live their life. And the greatest benefit is this is a lifelong treatment, right? The work you do now benefits you decades and decades from now.
Yeah. And I mean, I've seen like the OIT kind of treatment on TikTok, and they're picking up millions of views. I was gonna ask you in regards to then with adults, if they do this treatment, is there kind of a bigger risk, you could say, in some ways, in comparison to treating a child?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I would say I'm going to answer it two different ways.
Okay.
Remember, about 2/3 of our patients will go start to finish. That means start to finish without ever having a single symptom, which is remarkable. And it's a very good rate of non-events, nothing happening, you're good. In our adult patients or older patients, that number is often higher. Like they'll actually not have symptoms at all. Of those who have symptoms, the other 1/3, it's usually very mild. It's like one time, oral itch, a hive maybe. And our system has 24/7 on-call support. So we literally have hundreds of employees here supporting all of our patients around the world. So we're tracking this data and responding and making sure everything is moving in the right direction. The issue with adults is that their immune system does change, right? So once you're in your 30s or late 20s, your immune system does act differently than somebody who is a teenager. Now, we have collected enough data now where we believe we know how to actually take the blanket off of the adult immune system so we can see how it connects and operates. But sometimes for adults, we have to pay more attention. So what that means in short is that sometimes we have to do more testing for an adult who's in their 30s rather than, say, a teenager, but we are very comfortable managing those cases.
You mentioned there about your immune system kind of changing. Would that, for example, obviously I've had myology since the age of 5. Would the reaction still be as severe? I imagine it will be, but it's because you kind of mentioned there about your immune system changing. I'm just thinking, does the reaction get more severe as you get older or not?
That's exactly the right question to ask, right? And so the interesting thing is, it's not that the reaction becomes more aggressive or less aggressive. It actually changes. And I'll give you like an example, right? And so if you have a peanut allergy, peanut is, your memory to peanut is there. Your immune cells remember, they're like, oh, that's peanut. However, usually around 30, when you go in and do a skin test for peanut, it's very small. The response is very low. In fact, some allergists are even tricked into thinking, oh, maybe it's gone away. And then if you actually give that person peanut, they may be able to consume a tiny, tiny amount of peanut. But on that second or third day of getting a little bit of peanut, the reaction is really severe. So what happened there, right? Like it used to be that if you got, peanut when you were a kid, you got itchy right away, you may have some swelling, but now it took 3 days and a little bit of exposure to wake up your immune system. So we call that term, it's called senescence. It's basically a medical term for sleepiness. So it's almost like a sleepy immune system. And the problem with it is when you have a sleepy immune system, it can get aggravated by other things. So when you look at COVID, we saw a lot of patients I'm not talking about our patients, but people who have food allergies, when they got COVID for the next 90, 120 days, their reactivity to foods became much, much worse. And so it's interesting that, again, the adult immune system, because it acts sleepy sometimes, it's a bit more unpredictable. But again, I think with our system and the way we study it with our data science, I think we have a pretty good wrap on it.
I mean, I've never heard that. I mean, it's quite interesting. When you mentioned there, obviously, like if your immune system does go sleepy, say for example, I consume something and it potentially has got nuts in it and my system's sleepy. Does that mean I might not have reaction in that instance, but then if I do come in contact with nuts a few months later, a few days later, it'll be a lot worse?
100%. You nailed it.
Yeah.
It's really, it works like that. And I'll tell you, you see it best in the people who develop food allergies as an adult, right? I mean, remember, 2/3 of people who have food allergies will develop it after the age of 18. So and I'll kind of just walk you through an example if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you look at peanuts, right? So they can say, I ate peanuts when I was a kid, fine. Didn't really like them. That's what they'll usually say. I was never a big fan of them. And so they would eat peanuts kind of, once a year or something of that nature. And sometimes when you're 18 to 20 to 25 years of age, now you have your own control of your diet. So you may not even eat peanuts at all. And then what happens is your immune system has developed some memory and it said, do I want to be really tolerant to peanuts or do I want to remain in a position where I could develop a response? And then you have to start looking at the biosimilar proteins, right? So this could be that now this person who's in their 20s is a health food person and they eat lots of almond flour, right? Or almond smoothies and things of this nature.
Yeah.
And what that does is the protein that's biosimilar between almond and peanut, because they're consuming so much almond and they're totally fine, but the peanut numbers will start to go up, right? And so now they're 28 years old and they have peanuts. They haven't had peanuts for a decade. They actually get a pretty significant amount of oral or stomach-based symptoms. So their stomach hurts. And then they say, I don't know what that was. I used to be able to eat peanuts. I must be something else. And then 6 months later, they eat a peanut butter sandwich. And then they have a really severe reaction. And if you talk to anybody who has food allergies, the story I just mentioned is really similar to what they've experienced.
Yeah, I've one of the first ever guests actually I had on the podcast was someone I actually works with. And yeah, she'd been eating peanuts her whole life. Then one Christmas, parents were like, do you want some peanuts? And she went into full-on anaphylaxis. And yeah, it's scary, isn't it? Like I was going to say with in regards to anaphylaxis then, it's hard to say whether mine was a panic attack or not, but if the first anaphylaxis, obviously it's going to be bad and obviously very serious, but does it get worse later on? So if someone has anaphylaxis again for the second or third time, is that anaphylaxis going to be twice as bad as the first time?
I mean, the honest answer to your question is we don't have data on that, right? Like no one has collected enough, but I will tell you that understanding how the adult immune system operates, it does have the ability to progress. And we see this with other immune-based diseases, right? So if you look at conditions like celiac disease, another immune-based food disorder, certainly not food allergies, but similar, at least from the immune standpoint. If you look at diseases like lupus or autoimmune type conditions, the older you get, the more ability the immune system has to operate in a bit of a strange way or a little more unpredictable way. So I'll tell you, unfortunately, as you get older, we continue to see clinical reactions. They will have food anaphylactic reactions, and it may take less, amount of peanut to trigger a worse reaction. And that's something that has been at least reported. We've certainly seen it as clinicians. And I think long-term, this is why I so strongly believe that we have to put people into deep remission. That's the only way you keep this thing completely tucked away and that you don't have to worry about it again.
Yeah. I mean, what's kind of next for you in regards to AI? Obviously, I imagine it'd be obviously collecting more data, but have you kind of got any exciting projects kind of up your sleeve as well?
Oh yeah, totally. Love it. We're a technology company, and essentially our next step here is we're launching a patient app here in this next year. We've already run it for about 1,000 patients. Now we're expanding it to more patients, where the app runs on your phone and it's all specific to you, right? So remember that initial blood work, all that data, it's going to be a full experience. So all you have to do is pretty much use your phone and it'll tell you what to do, when to do it. We give the patients the gummies and they know when to take them. And we will use this as a experiential based form of treatment where this is not so much of a headache. This should be simple. It should be fun and interesting. And our hope is we can then use that AI data to make sure that not only are patients following the plan, but we can incentivize them. And because, one of the greatest things when you finish, a program, or even forget about finishing, let's say you get to a point where you can eat a large amount of peanuts or different tree nuts.
Yeah.
You should go enjoy that. You should go to new restaurants, try new things. But individuals who've been living with food allergies their whole life, they have habits, and those habits are really hard to break. So ultimately, we're looking to use our AI to really improve the patient experience. That's one thing. And then the second thing, we're actually using the AI to see when we can actually remove EpiPens in total from people, which is really exciting if you think about it, right? If we can actually find a way to remove EpiPens from ever having to be used again, that's our ultimate goal.
Yeah. And I mean, have you got any kind of stories where the kind of reaction from the parents or the kids where they can eat nuts for the first time or have that first birthday cake? I mean, that must be incredible to kind of see.
Oh, I tell you, every day I get letters. The patients will post on social media. We have an ongoing series on Instagram where it's like first cheeseburger, first Thai food, first chicken tikka masala, right? All the stuff that they've just never been able to have. And the look on the patients, on the kids, young adults' face. It's so cool. It's really, really remarkable. It really keeps us motivated to do what we do. And ultimately, we believe we are the, future of where this is all heading. Whether others build up AI systems, we encourage them to do it. I mean, this is the way we can actually fine tune medicine. But man, whatever time we have on this planet, if we can enjoy it to a maximum, this is one way to get there.
And do you ever fancy getting offices over in the UK so you get more UK patients?
We're working on it. No, we're definitely in a position to get there. We're looking at 2024 to open up a few more sites. We already have 2 sites in California. One's in San Diego, the very south of Southern California, and then our main headquarters is in Los Angeles. Our number one first goal is to get to the East Coast. So New York City is our target, the New York City area. At least that would cut the flight time down initially. I was in the UK last year, and I did have some conversations about how this would technically work and how we would have to open, given the rules and regulations of the UK. So it is definitely high on our list to find a way to get there.
I was going to say that with the regulations in the UK, are they very different, obviously, to the US? And do you think it would be quite tricky to kind of get it kind of past the UK?
It's interesting. What I learned there at with some folks I know at King's College was it's really not an issue from a regulatory standpoint. Like what we have as far as the AI system and the treatment model that's actually not a concern because we already have it submitted here to our FDA, and that kind of carries over to the UK. I think the difficult part is how to recruit physicians and other types of providers, if you will. And how do we train them? How does that work? And what's the jurisdiction? But we're definitely looking at the opportunity to cross the pond.
And if you're comfortable on obviously talking about this on the podcast, what is the cost? Is that something you'd be open to kind of talk about in terms of how much would it cost, for example, if I wanted to kind of come over to the US and start the treatment?
So, when I first started this program, I've always had the intention to make this as affordable as possible. I mean, my goal was to make this cost the same amount as orthodontics. So if you want pretty teeth, people will pay a little bit of money for 1 or 2 years, and then they have great smile for the rest of their life. I know it sounds a bit silly, but I felt that was a reasonable model. Because our model, again, we have hundreds and hundreds of employees. We have lots of space, activity, manufacturing, our own diagnostics laboratories and such, right? So this is a very expensive operation to run. We had to find the model that works well. As our population grows, we've been able to reduce cost. And so if you're in the US, the cost is less because we have insurance programs that cover those costs. So most of our patients are paying roughly around, if you add the cost of the treatment fees plus coming into the program, they're paying roughly around $7,000 per year to get treated. And that's only for 1, 2, or maybe 3 years at the most of what they're getting treated for.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, pretty fair. And then once they're done, the cost really just drops precipitously. For our folks who come from other countries, and again, we have a significant number of patients from all over the world, it is a little more difficult because unfortunately, there's no insurance that covers those other costs. Those individuals are roughly paying, closer to about $12,000 a year, which I know is a lot. It's about $1,000 a month, but it is only for that brief period of time. Yeah. It's a 1 year, 2 year type program. And again, we're very proud of the results we have of our patients who are international. It is quite remarkable. I feel in so many ways they are very dedicated to this program. They're dedicated to their own health, and because that dedication shows in the success rates.
Yeah. No, that's absolutely incredible. Honestly, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. Honestly, I feel like I've learned so much. Obviously, I've had other doctors and professors, but I feel like I've got so much away from this podcast, and it's definitely going to bring so much value for the listeners. So yeah, thank you so much. If anyone wants to obviously follow your clinic or follow yourself, would you like to share your website on the podcast?
Absolutely. It's foodallergyinstitute.com. We'd be happy to talk to anyone who's interested in what we do. We have a full team of counselors who can pick up the phone or chat with you via text. Great way to kind of learn more about our program. But ultimately, I really appreciate what you're doing, Daniel. This is all about advocacy and awareness, and it starts there. I think we have to empower both the young people and the adults, who have this condition. I'm very proud of the fact that we hire a lot of patients. I should say patients, not patients. We hire a lot of employees who have food allergies, and we are really aware, and we want to make sure that the global population who is impacted by this, that continues to grow, that we are all supported.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Anyway, thank you